If I ask you to tell me the name of the woman who broke up the Beatles, most of you would have Yoko Ono pop into your mind. Rightly or wrongly, she received a lot of criticism for the demise of that band. So much so that the phrase "to be a Yoko Ono" has become an idiom in English to mean someone who breaks up something else. Nobody likes to be blamed for the implosion of a great team, whether it be in sports, entertainment, or business. In our text today, the very first missionary team is torn asunder by its own version of a Yoko Ono, Barnabas' cousin, John Mark. So we pick up the text today in chapter 15, verses 30 and 31 to begin. It says, "The men were sent off and went down to Antioch, where they gathered the church together and delivered the letter. The people read it and were glad for its encouraging message." The men were sent off and went down to Antioch. Remember, this is picking up from last week. After reaching its decision in favor of the ongoing ministry to and conversion of Gentiles without preconditions, the council decided to send two representatives to go with Paul and Barnabas as a way of encouraging the church at Antioch. The two men chosen were Judas Barsabbas and Silas. We don't really know anything about this particular Judas, but Silas will take on an important role as Acts continues. It says, they gathered the church together and delivered the letter to them. This sounds to me like it's some sort of solemn occasion. They brought all the church together, they gathered everyone around, and they officially read the letter. They are now, the letter itself, the text of which is in verses 24 through 29, if you want to look at it later, declares that the men who had come from Jerusalem originally, we talked about them last week, the men that started all this trouble had been completely unauthorized. That now Paul, Barnabas, Judas, and Silas are official delegates from Jerusalem, and that they have decided that no burden will be placed upon the new Gentile Christians that would obligate them to try and obey the law of Moses. No, there are some requirements at the end of the letter that we haven't studied, we skipped over. They are simply an attempt to ask the Gentiles to be sensitive to Jewish cultural taboos, to avoid meat tainted by association with pagan sacrifice, as well as the sexual immorality often associated with Greek temples. These requests that James has put into this letter are far from being asked to follow the whole law like they had been previously confronted with. Instead, they are designed to lower the friction between the Jewish and Gentile cultures within the church. That's a reasonable compromise for someone like Paul to agree to, considering how far Peter and James have come in order to embrace the Gentiles. And so these same issues, you will see them later addressed by Paul, talking about meat sacrificed to idols and things of that nature, in his letter to the church in Corinth. How did the people respond to the letter? It said they heard the ruling and they were encouraged. They were glad. You see, the Jewish people at this point in history are not known to be welcoming to foreigners, as evidenced by the lumping of all non-Jewish peoples, be they Arabs, Greeks, Romans, Egyptians. They didn't care. They were all Gentiles. There was probably some trepidation in Antioch while Paul and Barnabas were at Jerusalem that the council would abandon them and declare that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah only. That catastrophic outcome, however, has been averted by the leadership of Peter and James and the passion of Paul and Barnabas. And now this positive decision by the council is received with joy by the Gentile believers in Antioch. Verses 32 and 33, it says, Judas and Silas, who themselves were prophets, said much to encourage and strengthen the brothers. After spending some time there, they were sent off by the brothers with the blessing of peace to return to those who had sent them. These two men were themselves prophets. We usually associate prophets with prophecy of future events, but most prophetic work in the Bible simply involves speaking to God's people on His behalf, not necessarily about the future. These two men had demonstrated that spiritual quality of a prophet. They had conveyed the teachings of God faithfully, and they used that gift now to serve the church at Antioch. What they did encouraged and strengthened the brothers, whatever they said. We're not told the content of their message, but its effect was clearly positive for the believers in Antioch. As men respected in Jerusalem and coming to them as official envoys, it would have been very helpful to have this personal ministry, in addition to the letter from the council. Because sending an official letter was very good. It was very useful to the church of Antioch. But sending two men to invest their time and their effort into building up this church, I think, is much better and much more meaningful. So it says that they spent some time there and then were sent off back home by the church. The efforts of Judas and Silas were a clear success, so much so that their encouragement was soon sufficiently conveyed and was no longer needed. Therefore, the church of Antioch sent them back home in gratitude to return to their families and their prior commitments. Verse 35, 34, 35, I'm off. Verse 35 tells us what Paul was up to. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, where they and many others preached the word of the Lord. Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch. At this point, it's clear to both Paul and Barnabas that God wants them to minister out here in the mission field, rather than to go back amongst their own kin in Jerusalem. The desire to reach their fellow Jews with the gospel is not going to go away. It remains with Paul and Barnabas, and it will continue to be a part of their ministry. But the opportunities to spread the gospel beyond Judea to that vast sea of Gentile populations all over the empire is a burden and a blessing that God has chosen these men for. It says they and many others taught and preached the word of the Lord. As Paul's letters that he will later write to the churches he is about to plant attest to us, it is no small thing to build up a healthy and functioning church from scratch, especially amongst a people who know nothing of the Lord beforehand. It's one thing to found a church today in America where people know a little bit. At least most people know at least a little bit about the Bible and God. Quite another to go to a land where they've never even heard of Him. So there's a tremendous amount of teaching to be done in order to raise up local leadership within the church so that it could function without the presence of outside teachers like Paul and Barnabas. In the past, there was a lack of training, and it was a serious flaw in our modern global mission efforts. But that has since been corrected, and now most mission agencies make the training of local pastors and local teachers a high priority. Most of them now see the independence of indigenous churches that can stand on their own as their ultimate goal. It was that discipleship training that Paul and Barnabas were doing in Antioch. So as we continue, verse 36, sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Paul says we need to go back. After spending some time once again in Antioch helping that church, this is the logical next step. Those newly formed churches certainly need the help from the men who started them. Paul and Barnabas feel a certain fatherly pride and obligation toward those communities and have a strong emotional reason why they should go back for another visit. You see, sometimes churches or individual Christians get a little bit too focused on finding new people to share the gospel with, without considering the discipleship needed for those who have already become followers of Jesus Christ. You see, being a follower of Jesus isn't exactly an easy path to walk. Even for veterans of the spiritual wars of living for Jesus, there needs to be ongoing efforts to teach and to train new Christians, along with the ongoing efforts to reach the lost with the gospel. Paul's missionary efforts in Acts demonstrate a clear commitment both to evangelism and discipleship. And here's where our text is going to focus this morning, verses 37 to 41. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. Paul and Barnabas agreed on the need to revisit the churches from their previous trip, but the cause of disagreement between them will arise, not over the direction of the mission, but over its execution. Often different Christians have the same overall goals. We know what we want to accomplish, but run into problems when common ground cannot be found in how to pursue those goals. Barnabas was famous for his belief in people. It was Barnabas that had stood by Paul during his initial trip to Jerusalem after his conversion, way back in chapter 9, when nobody else would do it. It was Barnabas that had stood for Paul. Barnabas believed in Paul, and thus a friendship and partnership was formed that God was able to use mightily for the gospel. Barnabas believed in second chances, even for men of murderous hatreds who had seen the light, like Paul. Barnabas believed that Mark, the eventual writer of the Gospel of Mark with Peter's help, that Mark needed a second chance. But Paul did not think it wise to take him. You see, well-meaning people can disagree on the very best way to accomplish a common goal. Barnabas saw this as a chance to redeem Mark and put him to good use once again. But Paul worried about the effect upon the work that might result from bringing along Mark. One man was focused on an individual's needs in light of the overall mission. The other was weighing the mission's need over that of an individual. Two ways to look at that. One man is trying to win the battles. The other man is looking at the war. Or one man is focusing on the trees, and the other is looking at the forest. We often have that conflict in people's vision. Which one is right? Is helping one man worth endangering the whole mission? Or is the mission too important to risk for any one man? This is the type of decision that two people who are both trying to serve God could easily disagree upon. Such problems arise in the church today on a regular basis. We know that we're supposed to be doing. We know what the big picture is. We may even agree on some of the specific steps that we need to take in order to accomplish God's work. But the details can still prove to be a tough obstacle to overcome when people of differing viewpoints are trying to work together. The reason for Paul's reluctance: he had deserted them before. On their last trip, he had gone away. Barnabas believed he could help Mark to fulfill his potential. His motive for wanting to include him is clear. Paul, on the other hand, had been burned once by Mark and wasn't willing to take that risk again. We don't know why Mark left the first time. It has been speculated that he disagreed with the Gentile focus of the outreach efforts and may even have opposed Paul at the recent council in Jerusalem. That is only speculation, but it would certainly add a personal dimension to Paul's very emotional reaction against Mark. It might explain why Paul is so adamant that he is not taking him. You see, Paul may have been all for second chances in theory, but not for someone he worried might still harbor ill feelings toward the Gentile Christians they're going to try to build up on this trip. See, our own past, emotional pain, can get in the way of serving God. If we've been hurt by a fellow Christian, it makes it much harder to work with that person in the future. We may feel like we've forgiven what has happened, but being asked to work alongside someone who has hurt you deeply can be too much for most of us. So for Paul and Barnabas, they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Now, Luke does not blame either Paul or Barnabas for the breakup of their team. In the second, and we can't judge either of them either. I can't read my own handwriting again. It happens all the time. We don't need to blame Barnabas for being naive and say, geez, Barnabas, come on, you can't trust Mark. And we don't need to blame Paul for not forgiving and moving on. It doesn't matter in the end. When the church is made up of sinners saved by grace, and that's all we're ever going to have in here, there will always be conflicts that arise over personal issues and philosophical differences. Such problems are inevitable. The question is, how do we respond to them? Paul and Barnabas could find no compromise that they could agree to, so they ended up going their separate ways. The partnership that had served them both so well was dissolved. But what of the friendship? We don't hear very much about Barnabas working with Paul in the future. But we do know one thing that makes us think that their friendship survived this disagreement. Barnabas was right about Mark. Paul will later refer to Mark as helpful to me in my ministry. He writes that in 2 Timothy 4:10, and list him along with the gospel author Luke as an indispensable fellow worker. Some point in the future, Paul realized how good Mark really could be. You see, it was too hard for Paul to agree to work with Mark now. But Barnabas took the chance, and it paid off. Later, Paul came around, and Mark became a trusted ally in his work. Are we in the business of giving people second chances? We are. Ours is a mission of reconciliation, both to the son who squanders his father's money and to the faithful prodigal son who resents him when he returns. Will we as a church and as individuals be burned when we trust people who have hurt us before? We will. But our Heavenly Father has continued to love us and seek to reform us, despite our failures and betrayals of Him. So we must do likewise, even if it does get us hurt. We're told that Barnabas took Mark and he sailed for Cyprus. Barnabas took the chance on his cousin Mark and went to his home island of Cyprus. We don't know how Mark proved himself on this or some other subsequent trip, but he did. Whatever happened on the first trip was eventually repaired by the faithfulness that Barnabas helped him to demonstrate. Such mentoring and training is a mission worthy of a disciple of Jesus Christ. After all, did he not eat with tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners in his efforts to show them the path to repentance? We can certainly be a part of God's plan to offer healing and renewal to those who have a checkered past. Told that Paul chose Silas and left, going to Syria. From this point forward, Luke will focus on Paul's story, as he will be one of Paul's companions through much of his journeys and trials. The companion that Paul chose to assist him was none other than that same prophet from Jerusalem who had recently done so much help for the church at Antioch, Silas. Silas was, like Paul, a Roman citizen, and will prove himself to be an indispensable support to Paul as they share that prison cell in Philippi, and Silas assists Paul as his amanuensis, or secretary. After their disagreement, both Paul and Barnabas continued in their work that God had called them to. Now that argument could have grown into a bitter feud. It could have derailed either one of them or both of them. But it did not. And that's an important lesson for us this morning. They disagreed, they couldn't work together, but they both continued to do the work of God. You see, these two men of God could not see eye to eye about Mark, but they both knew that Jesus was Lord, and service to God came first. So as a church, we will have troubles between people who are a part of God's family. Such conflict is certain to come, but it need not ever detract us from our common goal to share the gospel with the lost and make disciples, because we do indeed serve the God of second chances.